Hello class, and welcome to your week 4 lecture where we'll be discussing what constitutes successful reintegration and how we define what this means. So our learning objectives for this lesson that by the end you should be able to explain reentry as a transitional process rather than an isolated event. You'll be able to compare and contrast the 4 key theoretical perspectives that help to understand the reentry process, as well as explore how drugs, family, friends, employment, community membership, and mental health converge to impact successful reentry. So we're going to start looking at and exploring what reentry looks like for someone who's returning home from prison, and understanding this really as a process and not just one isolated event of the person being released. So we'll look at what challenges they face, what the first few days of transitioning back into the community actually look like, and who's there waiting for them. And what are these reentrants feeling within those first few days? We'll answer and look at all of these things throughout this week's readings, videos, and podcasts. So first we'll talk about Homeward Chapter 3. Transitions. So really this chapter just talks about what it's like for these individuals transitioning back home, transitioning from prison back into their communities, back into their families. And the quote, "Freedom after prison is not a status granted by release, but something gradually attained," really speaks to that as being a process and not just simply reentry is, you're back home now, great. It's how do they fall back into their families? How do they fall back into their communities to become what they want to be? So the method of returning home varied greatly for the participants in the Homeward study. 1/3 of them were picked up by family members, and then 1/4 were each picked up by either a friend or a brother, and 1/4 were picked up through state transportation or were taken to wherever it was they were going through state transportation. Within the first week came a lot of feelings of stress and nervousness. These people reported loneliness and anxiety around crowds particularly, though they did say within the first few weeks of returning that this tended to subside. But they had just this overall discomfort with the pace of life. It was a lot faster than they were used to, and they had clumsiness with simple and small tasks. Things even like advancing technologies. How do you use a cell phone, depending on how long you were incarcerated? How do you apply for jobs when everything is online and you're not used to the internet? Things we know change around us quite quickly. And for someone who's been incarcerated, who's had someone telling them what to do at every point of the day, essentially, this can be difficult for them. So that the stress of transitioning really was intensified by drug addiction and mental illness, but some of that could be relieved through family supports. So 40% of respondents reported that they had anxiety in the first week after release, and a lot of them were even being released without prescriptions. So while they were incarcerated, they had access to mental health medications, maybe things for anxiety and depression, but when they were released, they weren't given any type of supply until they could reach out to their primary care physician and get a refill on those prescriptions. The younger participants are ones who tended to be picked up by family members or friends, whereas when we talk about that state transportation, a lot of that was really your older releasing inmates, which happened to be linked to poor social integration 6 months after the fact. So again, tough to deal with coming out when you're sort of older. Maybe you don't have the family there to support you, to come pick you up. And that really shows true that if you had to take state transportation, you most likely don't have that social support there to help you 6 months later. Moreover, 2/3 of the sample had to meet with probation or parole officers, which gave them restrictions on drug and alcohol use. They had supervision fees they had to worry about. And some of them were given welcome home parties, while some of them were not. So 2/3 of those who had no mental health or drug addiction tended to have a welcome home party, compared to only 1/6 of those who had one of those issues. So individuals that experienced those mental health and drug addiction, again, maybe didn't have quite the same family or social supports as others did. And 20% of those who were 40 to 50 years of age had a party, while 60% of your younger respondents had welcome home parties. Again, showing that those younger participants in the study were more likely to have a welcome home party. Maybe these individuals haven't burned all of their bridges yet with their family and friends. Maybe this was their first instance of being incarcerated. Whereas maybe the individuals who are in their 40s or 50s, they've either burned all of their bridges with their family and friends, they don't have anybody there for them to throw a party, or maybe they've been in and out of the system so many times that it's sort of old news. There's no reason to have another welcome home party for them. And then looking at the living arrangements upon release, it was interesting to know that in the 40 to 50-year-old respondent age range, most of them entered shelters or transitional housing, and then therefore reported more likely to be lonely and feeling socially isolated, as compared to your younger respondents who mostly went back to family members or maybe a partner who they shared a child with. So returning home looked different for different age groups. It also looked different depending on mental health and drug addiction that individuals struggled with. So talking about sort of having that support, when we look at the factors of stabilization and support that these individuals had, a lot of them needed housing and financial assistance. And they got that from family members, which was the most common for women and young men, and those that didn't have mental health or drug addiction. So 85% of those under 30 years of age within the first 6 months had most of this assistance from family members. 70% who had no mental health or drug addiction, and 50% had dual diagnosis. So we also need to look at, when we talk about this housing and financial assistance, having insecure housing. So those who had sex offenses tended to be excluded from public housing options, and sober houses or residential programs would give people little privacy. So some individuals would turn to hotels or motels that would have, say, weekly rates that they could rent at. But there's a fair amount of individuals who just ended up being homeless or living on the streets, living in tents and shelters. So this happened. Insecure housing was common with 70% of older respondents, but only 16% of those who were under the age of 30. When we talk about employment builds pride. Employment gives a social status and a daily routine for people. It gives them that stability, and it gives them support in having coworkers that they can befriend, positive influences. But having poor health, having a criminal record, some of these individuals had either poor work histories or no work histories, and lacking education, mostly a high school diploma, are obstacles that stood in the way of individuals finding employment. And even when they did, a lot of it was labor work, a lot of it was temporary positions. It was really rare that individuals would find steady full-time work. So public assistance was really leaned on heavily. And when we think about this, that half of these individuals left prison with $330 or less. However, when you had those that had maybe longer sentences, they would sometimes leave with more money, even up into the thousands, because they were there for a longer period of time. They had more time to save up that money. But in the same breath, those who had dual diagnoses, so mental health, drug addiction, issues like that, are given less opportunities to make money in prison and typically tended to leave with less than $200. So it's not really giving them a stable base to start out with coming out. So if you don't have that social support there, you're really going to struggle coming out of prison. When we talk about reintegrating socially, first you had to have all of those things before, right? You have to have money, you have to have housing, and now you're trying to reintegrate into a social world that has maybe advanced faster than you did being incarcerated. So this social integration, especially right after release, really requires being able to manage your stress, being able to manage that anxiety, those feelings of loneliness, so they feel lonely, but then they're also afraid of crowds, and crowds give them anxiety. So how do you wrestle with those two things? And they found that older reentrants and those who had drug addiction or mental health just didn't socially integrate as well as their counterparts did. So moving on to the other article for this week, which was Successful Reentry, what differentiates successful and unsuccessful parolees? So we know what sort of in the homeward study, what these individuals were coming out to, what they were feeling, what they were going through. Now, sort of what differentiates success and unsuccess? Well, we first have to look at some of the theoretical perspectives in reentry. So there's 4 main theoretical perspectives that this article discusses. You have your social learning theory, which is obviously saying that criminal motivations are learned through association with significant others or those interpersonal networks. And self-efficacy is important because this is the idea of how well someone can make judgments and make those right decisions within those learning environments. You then have social control theory, which is the development of bonds to pro-social people or institutions, such as churches, employment, school, which help people to desist from crime. You then have cognitive transformation theory. So cognitive transformation theory has a few elements to it. One, the person has to develop an openness to change. They have to be willing to change something about themselves that keeps or that has put them in the criminal justice system, that has put them in situations where they have been arrested. They then have to be exposed to hooks or circumstances that help them move toward the change. Those hooks can typically be things like marriage, a job, a child, even entering into programs. And then that person has to develop a conventional replacement self. So they have to see themselves in a new light. They have to see themselves not as a criminal anymore. And then they have to have this reinterpretation of their previous illegal behavior. So they now see crime for what it is, and they don't want to be associated with that type of a lifestyle anymore. And then they can form these redemptive narratives where their real self is viewed as non-criminal, and the previous self or the previous behavior they had were just results of mistakes and bad choices and negative influences that were in their lives. So it follows this progression first of being open to change, then being exposed to a hook or circumstance, so something that would make them want to change, developing that conventional replacement self, so really seeing themselves as somebody different now, and then reinterpreting their past illegal behaviors and seeing them for what they are. So now they can say, you know what, that's not me anymore. I don't want to be associated with that. And then life course theory, which actually just combines all 3 of these. So it integrates social learning theory, social control, and cognitive transformation, and views desistance as a process that depends on structured routine activities, social controls, but also agency. So someone's ability to be responsible and make their own choices and decisions. And this occurs over a period of time. It doesn't just happen in one day, similar to the process of reentry. It is a process. It's a combination of individual choices and support networks that then help them remove themselves from that criminal lifestyle. So in the current study, they had 193 felony parolees that they followed over 3 years. 55% of these were successfully discharged, 25% remained on parole, and 20% were returned to prison. So these individuals were from 2 major metropolitan areas in an intermountain state in the United States, and all but one believed that they would actually return to prison, and all of them said that family was a very helpful resource for them. They also said that drug use was a major risk factor for returning to prison. More time spent with friends and enjoyable activities was found to be positively related to the individual's ability to be successful. So unfortunately, the other side of that, though, is their inability to resist old negative peers was correlated with being unsuccessful on parole. So while spending leisure time in a positive manner with friends doing enjoyable activities, those enjoyable activities can't be antisocial, pro-criminal activities. And they found that employment was actually unrelated to success, which is very interesting because a lot of research is going to tell you that employment is very important. Employment is very important for someone to be successful. When they talk about success here, it's were they successfully discharged off of parole? So in this case, success is simply defined that way. It is not how successful is the person financially, economically, socially. Emotionally, it's only were they successfully discharged off of parole. And having a strained and less supportive family was associated with being unsuccessful. So when they didn't have those family resources there to help them, they struggled a little bit more. So our last article here is talking about ex-offender accounts of successful reentry from prison. So what do these individuals say is helpful for them to be successful when they're returning? So the current study looked at 58 former offenders who were participating in one of two faith-based organizations. 47 of these were considered successful. And what they did was they covered background and case history, they covered reintegration, family support, employment and education. They also asked sex offender specific questions. So they really looked at the person to tell their narrative, to tell their story. They found that there were a lot of challenges with stable housing and employment. These individuals also experienced stigmatization, shame, discrimination, and embarrassment. And they noted how sort of overcoming that felon label was really critical to have a successful reentry. So looking at some of the themes that make someone successful, what came out of this was reverence, reconstruction, and reunification. So having this reform through faith and religious devotion or having strong social networks, sometimes individuals were able to use Bible studies and faith-based programs that really helped them to overcome their sort of shameful past, and they found new identities in God. They also then had this intensity of being separated from their loved ones or feeling like forgotten about while they were incarcerated. So this reunification process or being accepted by family and society was really important for them then during that reentry process. And reconstructing their identities or roles, so by becoming parental figures, by being counselors or role models for others, and taking on those generative roles really gave meaning to their life and helped them to be successful and overcome all of these experiences like the stigmatization, shame, discrimination, and embarrassment, and help them overcome that felon label. So let's sum up all of these articles. Older respondents and those with drug addiction or mental health struggled the most to transition and socially reintegrate when we're talking about the Homeward study. The life course theory incorporates social learning, social control, and cognitive transformation theory to explain successful versus unsuccessful reentry. Drug use, strained and unsupportive families, and returning to old friend groups are associated with being unsuccessful during reentry. However, reverence, reconstruction, and reunification are common themes among those who are able to successfully reenter and reintegrate into society. So this was your week 4 lecture, and I hope you all have a wonderful week.